Good afternoon. We are ready to begin. Okay. I hope you all enjoyed the morning session. We are continuing now with the afternoon session. It's my pleasure to introduce Katerina Tiktopoulou. Katerina Tiktopoulou is an associate professor in modern Greek literature at the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki. Her major scientific interests include medieval vernacular and modern literature, manuscript studies, scholarly editing, and digital humanities. She was editor-in-chief of the second revised diplomatic edition of the manuscripts of the Greek national poet Dionysios Solomos, Athens, 1998 to 2012. She is the director of the Laboratory of Philology and New Technologies of the Department of Philology at the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki. Her current principal projects are the digital edition of the Dionysios Solomos manuscripts, Solomos Digital Archive, and the study of the 19th century Greek literature using NLP methods, which is semantic analysis of 19th century Greek fiction with text mining techniques. We welcome Katerina Tiktopoulou. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and I'm very happy to be here, to be invited here. It's an honor. So the title of my talk, Literature in the Light of the Digital Screen, refers to the encounter between literature and digital technologies. Literature is part of our everyday life, and as everyday life changes, so does the field of literature. The encounter or intersection between literature and digital technologies takes place within the dynamic of the so-called digital transformation. That is the process of using digital technologies to create new or modify existing experiences and processes in almost all areas of our everyday life, such as culture, education, business. The numbers delivered by these overviews of the adaptation and use of connected devices and services are very indicative. It is about reimagining our world in the digital age. So we can say right away, digital transformation is turning literature, both old and new, into data. Now, this kind of transformation raises many questions and various reactions. Acceptance and enthusiasm, or wariness and skepticism, even resistance, and at the end, a stoic acceptance. The river cannot go back. Of the various questions, I wish to single out here one particularly important. That is how the proliferation of digital technologies and of artificial intelligence affects formative concepts and theories about literature. The transformation is happening now, and we are part of it. We observe it, we attempt to map it, to understand it, in order to use it for the benefit of our societies, avoiding what could be negative, maybe mainly our ignorance of how it functions. But we lack the necessary distance. In addition, any attempt at description is influenced by the subjectivity of the observer and the specific circumstances that determine what is observed. For instance, who is talking is obviously not a born digital, but some of the students present here today are, and especially the children who are growing up and are about the age to go to school. They and I conceive the digital transformation in a different way, and we necessarily have different experiences and perspectives. Also, digital transformation has many speeds, depending on the geography and social differences, the existence or not of the internet, the familiarity with new technologies. With these preliminary assumptions in mind, my talk will attempt to present some basic aspects of the changes happening in the field of literature in the digital age, and some of the issues raised. For easy discussion, I will divide the talk into 3 parts, each of which will refer to a different aspect: writing literature, reading literature, and finally, the professional mediation of literature. Of course, writing, reading, and the discourse about literature actually communicate with each other, and it's difficult to refer to one without the other. So I will start with literature as an act of writing. There must be very few people left who still use pencil and paper to write literature today, or typewriters. The majority use the computer. What has primarily changed is, of course, the material medium, but every time the material changes, it creates a chain of changes. As the scholar of the history of the book, Roger Chartier, observed, commenting on the transition from manuscript to print, the new forms and new technologies of print lead to new reading behaviors and new uses of the books, which interact with the intellectual world of the readers and with the meaning of the text. As we are only at the beginning of a similar change, it is not only the material support that matters, but also the medium for which we are writing. Many writers, maybe the majority, write text having the book as a paradigm, as the medium of the dissemination of their text. An equally large portion, though, perhaps growing larger than the previous one, writes for the computer. This does not simply mean that by publishing their text, are willing to accept the changes that accompany the transition of some journals' digital format, as in the Greek example you can see here. It means mainly that they write with an awareness of the many different possibilities offered by the medium, such as hypertextuality, multimediality, multimodality. You see here, it's a poem that one can read, must read, with the video, playing also the video. As has been observed, this new possibility, the interplay between different representational modes or forms, changes the very definition of text and its meanings. New forms are created and new meanings are produced. Still, the changes of the act of reading, still the changes of the act of writing literature for the computer screen are much more extensive. Access to the medium and the network can make each one a writer and in the same time a publisher of himself, since she can publish on websites or social media. Is this literature valid? Is it good? The notion of literariness, as well as the notion of the canon, have long been called into question. A common response is that anyone can write literature. Most often, these are concepts that had already begun to be subverted, and that now, because of the medium, change has been accelerated. One of the most typical concepts that have changed is that of the author. Having ceased to be the author at the center of the interpretive interest, the reader has then focused on the text and on his own or her own personal interpretation of the text, and now becomes the author in the place of the author. The same can be said of literary criticism. More and more readers are getting involved and are taking the role of the critic by writing mainly in the social media. Next to the reading clubs, websites are being developed to host the critical expression of each reader. Thus, also in the literary field, because of the medium, traditional roles are in constant negotiation. It is certainly interesting to study the ongoing phenomenon of e-literature, although it is not easy due to its volume and dispersion. One of the questions could be whether a mechanism of taxonomy and classification, similar to those of the print literature, will be developed. The well-known platform e-literature seems to be trying to do something like this, using the tools of periodical publishing and of anthological classification with various keywords. At the moment, it seems that many authors, after submitting to online journals or uploading to social media, are turning to the print world, perhaps because they feel it necessary as the next step for getting their work recognized. The two media are, of course, very different. Print has other possibilities than electronic. Print cannot capture movement or connectivity. So sometimes a combination of the two arises. A text has both a printed and an electronic version. As has been pointed out, meanings shift backwards and forwards across and between different forms, the one form complementing the other for the peculiarities of its media, its affordances. The field of electronic literature thus appears as the predominantly experimental one, due to its multimodality, fluidity, and freedom of access, while the print world, with its familiar hierarchy, still retains its glamour and institutionality. Two different worlds. Yet, if the print can maybe lend some of its values to the paradigm of digital literature, the latter can return to the literature written in the paradigm of the print some elements of its own evolution. A good example is the case of the microfiction. Thanks to the immediacy of access and the speed of the medium, microfiction or flash fiction flourish in it. But they also seem to influence literature written in the paradigm of print. They influence the short story or even the novel and narrative in general and its poetics. Perhaps the greatest distance between the print and the digital paradigm in literary writing is captured in the following cases. The first is the collaboration between human and computer in the production of literary text. An especially designed interactive platform, such as this one, asks you to enter a series of elements and asks you to make some choices. And in the end, it gives you the text based on the formulated recipe. The second one is one of the several experiments in the production of new forms of poetry that arise automatically from appropriate computer programming. This is a poetry created by Nick Montfort. Of course, there always has been a restless search of new forms in literature. We can recall the experiment in the 60s of the group of French-speaking writers, artists, and mathematicians who took the name Oulipo, an acronym for Workshop of Potential Literature. The difference here is that the experimentation is mediated not only by another medium, the computer, but also by another code. A computational language whose presence is made explicit. If we could watch the video, we could see that this is an alphabet expanding. It's the name of the poem. It's a concrete poem generated through the Perl computer language. Letters of the alphabet frantically move around the screen, at times raining down sideways and other times dancing. As Montfort himself states, there are different ways of exploring poetry and language. Computer-generated poems offer a new avenue to do it. So, computer-generated literary text, production of literature using artificial intelligence and natural language generation, artifacts that can disrupt any convention of reading and especially studying literature. They necessitate distinct approaches as far as textual interpretation and authorship is concerned. Texts that require special skills for both the writer and the reader, and critical skills, according to Mark Marino in his Critical Code Studies Manifesto, which argues that code is read not only by programmers, but by lawyers, artists, reporters, political activists, and literary scholars. It is used in political debates, works of art, popular entertainment, and historical accounts, and invite us all to learn to read code actively, critically. At this point, we can leave literature as an act of writing and move on to the aspect of reading. It has already been said with regard to writing that the material support of the text has its own specific significance. The same applies to reading. Reading practices, a practice that now contains the dual substance of the computer, evolves into a complex process which includes the implicit decoding of visual signs on the screen, but also a variety of other cultural uses of the computer. Reading is not only an exercise of simple comprehension, explanation, and interpretation of text. It is a whole process that refers to image, speech, senses, memory, learning, enjoyment. Every practice, the overall formation of the identity of social group and subjects. There is no doubt that anyone, or almost anyone, who reads in the 21st century reads not only on paper, but also on screen. So almost immediately the need arose to look more closely at the ways in which screens affect readers and the act of reading. A diversity of methods are being used to empirically investigate the impact of the reading medium, and theoretical frameworks are called in to interrogate its features and consequences. There is an extremely rich literature, mostly papers, that try to describe the differences between reading from print and reading on screen in terms of both general texts, scientific and non-scientific, and the reading of literature. Empirical approaches, case studies, combined with more theoretical approaches. So, in what extent does the screen affect spatial cognition of reading? How much does the screen pushes or not to a non-linear reading? I will limit myself to some findings that are also relevant to the reading of literature. As it will be seen, the findings differ depending on the group of people who participate in the research and the time period. The design features of ebooks and online text matter, but so do the purpose of reading, type of readers, and reading genre. So, for example, one of the first findings was that literature reads better on the screen than scientific texts, for which one needs to take notes. But the findings were different if the respondents had devices or knew how to use programs that allowed them to take notes or color code the text on the screen. It also turned out that better understanding meant be able to follow the plot of the literary work, but didn't take into account the pleasure parameter. Still, if the sample was a long text, then length was a contributing factor to abandoning reading on the screen. At present, the absence of materiality seems to be recognized as crucial for reading literature from the screen. Even younger readers argue that physical contact with the paper, with the book, helps with absorption of the text and delight, because, as experts say, it allows for immersion. Also, the screen works negatively, even for young people, when they have to read a long text, such as a novel, even if the text alternates with image and hypermedia elements. Perhaps the speed that characterizes the digital dimension and turns into a reading ethos plays a role. This, in his afterword to the future of the book, Umberto Eco states, electronic communication travels ahead of you. Books travel with you at your speed. Are we in what David Bolter calls the late age of print? I do not think it helps to get involved in predictions. Perhaps the book will not disappear as long as there is interest in it. It will depend on its potential for adaptation to the new era, but it is possible that at some point it too will pass alongside with the scrolls and the handwritten codes that we have turned into digital objects and study on the screen. And with this, we can move on to the third and final part and look at the developments. This is a very interesting experiment with reading, but maybe we can see it in the end. So now we can move on to the third and final part and look at the developments that the digital competition has caused in the field of literature in terms of its study, mainly scholarly editing and interpretation. Interpretation and scholarly editing of literary text are acts of powerful mediation between the text and the reader. Indeed, in the case of editing, the mediation seems almost invisible. One needs to think in order to realize that there is another hand besides the author that may have drastically altered the text. And this, as Professor Mikros was saying yesterday morning, can be misleading for stilometry and other kinds of studies of the text. For centuries, the goal of scholarly editors was to give the reader a definitive text, which at best was thought of to be identical to what the author had written or wanted to write. A typical form of a scholarly edition of a text, ancient, medieval, or even modern, up to the 19th century, included an introduction written by the editor with references to the author, the period, the text, its editorial issues, and how they were addressed in the edition in question. Then the text followed, accompanied by commentary in the form of a footnote or endnotes, where a number of factual and interpretive comments were also made, most of the time critical to the understanding of the text. And then there was a glossary of difficult words and photographs of the manuscripts and of other documents. This tendency, the emphasis on a single, fixed, and definite text, began to be challenged theoretically as early as the 70s. When it was established, for example, that in the case of medieval text variations were not necessarily a corruption of the original text, but were often deliberate adaptations of it. Or when it was found out that a 19th century author had himself approved and published different versions of her work at different times, and that was something interesting to present and to study. Or when it was found out that in the archival of an author, we have the avant texts that show his creative writing process, or when the final versions are different from the published ones. Multiplicity discontinuity, non-linearity, fluidity, it is easy to see today that these textual characteristics can be better served by the digital medium than by print. However, at the beginning of a transition from print to digital media, predominated what is characterized by the term assimilation. Assimilation refers to the extension of existing knowledge in the digital environment and usually aims at the preservation or dissemination of data. One version is the PDF format. Another, the use of digital photographs. Gradually, however, the very dynamics of the medium and the technology led to what is characterized by the term distinction. Distinction focuses on the analysis of pre-existing knowledge through the application of new methodologies or the formulation of new research questions, aiming to differentiate itself from the rest of the digital humanities ecosystem by ultimately proposing something new, something renewed in relation to pre-existing methodological practices and approaches. The difference between the two models is obvious. The second model seems to incorporate technology as a research object, while the first uses as a tool. Examples of this second approach are now numerous and growing. One of the first is the publication of the works of the American poet Walter Whitman. Here, issues such as those faced by editors in the past are solved very differently. All the editions of Whitman's work and all the influential and meaningful reprints are offered to the reader as well as manuscripts. Also photographic material, reviews, and the author's library. This is something very different from an opera omnia edition or even an archive edition. In fact, the very term archive is also being revisited, renovated, as it now contains not only static material that at some point ceased to be enriched, but the dynamic material to which new material is constantly being added. The website, which is at the same time edition, archive, library, also includes teaching suggestions and material from events about the author and about his era. A key element that gives added value to this website is the metadata and the possibility of tagging the text with XML, and in most of the cases, according to the TI protocol. Thanks to the formation of text corpora, to annotation, to the invention or adaptation of new tools, and to the effective use of the possibilities of the medium, new environments for reading and studying literature in every respect are formed. A typical example is the Shelley Goldwyn archive, which presents the digital edition of the archive of the Shelleys, Percy and Mary. Here, the user can find and study the manuscript face-to-face with their diplomatic transcription. And thanks to the annotation made, the user can search among other things. Doesn't look very well, but she can search for the hand of Percy and the hand of Mary, that both happen to write in the same page because of the annotation that has been made. The challenges and the problems of such projects are not few. One of the most basic is the issue of sustainability. What is needed to ensure that all this effort does not become dysfunctional because of the constantly evolving technology? Or how can these complex reading environments be made more reader user-friendly and allow for even greater interaction? What is certain is that these projects for the digital edition and study of literature require teamwork and interdisciplinarity. Interdisciplinarity that results not only from the collaboration within the members of a team, each one coming from a different discipline, but this interdisciplinarity has to be a characteristic of the individuals themselves, who now seem to have to combine at least to some extent, knowledge from different fields. The digital humanist is nowhere described as one who masters all aspects of each field, but as a scientist who seeks to understand what is happening in the field, in his field, to participate in its developments and to contribute to the progress of the community. I would like to emphasize the word collectively, as collaboration and openness are important characteristics of digital humanities. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Tiktopoulou, for that very inspiring talk. It has a new perspective on viewing literature, which is politics. Do we have any questions? Strange question. You said bacteria. It's not right this time. So you were saying something about the relationship with media. It's affordance and certain consciousness. So I was wondering, have you thought about what effect speech to text might have on the future? Because the dictation capacity of the digital, right, it's not just a screen, it's the capacity to speak. And have you thought about what impact that might have?
Yes, in fact, it's a very important fact of the future of the digital editions, even because we preparing this edition of Solomos, we thought that it would be a nice idea to incorporate an audio guide. So the user, the reader of Solomos's manuscript can find his way around the avant texts, the different corrections, and so he can read, the user can read a small text in order to understand what's about, but at the same time can choose audio guidance and be guided. So yes, it's very important characteristic of the computer.
Of course, listening to your talk as a professor in the primary education, so many things came to mind on how it can be used for education. And that combined with watching Mary and Lynn's grandchildren today on their tablets, how interesting, so many things that we can use to make literature interesting for students.
Yes, yes. They're not very well explored, but even these platforms that help you write script something, they can be used for in class.
And how interesting to have the students write poetry or
yes, and
it's very far away from that.
Or even these archives, such as Sally Godwin, that can demonstrate how it's difficult to write, and one must write and rewrite and correct, and so it's not an inspiration; it's about working with the text, and sometimes they can come in and complete an incomplete poem. Exactly. So it's very interactive and it's very interesting for them too.
Very interesting and very promising. Continue your work. Any other questions?
Yeah, you started mentioning that nobody does scribing anymore, right? We're all the time using computers. And one of the things about that is the fact is that a very different process, because scribing is something which is linear and what resists is the spatiality of paper. You've got to cross something out and make use of it. So, you know, you can't be capped into a kind of linearity. But one of the things about the digital writing is the cursor, where everything is recoverable, everything is always perfect along the way. So the question is, that's just one example. It's a very different human process of scribing and working on the screen to write. The question really is, does it change the writing? You know, so there was somebody interviewed photographs. Photographs said you always tell whether somebody written something on a computer or handwritten. He only had handwriting. You know, like, has that? That's a radical change in our practices of writing. Has it changed what writing is?
I think I was saying that there are many writers now that they write directly on the computer, and they don't write with pen or pencil anymore. And now they are trying to develop a kind of word programs that can save the drafts, because sometimes we will not have any avant text. We will not have any drafts of these authors. So that's a problem to solve, because these words save only the last version. And so I don't know if I understand well your answer, your question.
Yes. Yeah, maybe I can follow up, because I remember the point how writing changes. And I'm a writer myself. I'm writing poetry and lyrics since 2008. Digitization of writing is really important. We don't need to keep it the same. You're writing, but sharing your writing with publishers. But also, I mean, yes, with technology can change things in how we write online, but it's only the new era of even tablets that they have the pens. So it's a tendency that we could really have this need to go back and writing again.
Yes.
I mean, online and linking in the previous comment and your comment about creating writing and not putting it in education. How do we bring this to creating writing in primary school students in Greece? It's an enormous result without the technology, the more technological and stimuli, giving them more things to see and hear rather than writing in a tablet. I believe 3 comments now, but trying to conclude my comment as well is that, yeah, it is important and you tend more to be more technology of writing and saving our writing, but again, the generation, the actual writing of the paper, you know, I can't still, I have my first book published, I can't still get the paper and it's such a completely different experience if you mentioned it. Yet describing like
Yes, it is true that the physical contact with the pen, with the paper, it's the same valid for reading. It's very different reading literature from the book. And even young people admit that they feel more comfortable, the pleasure is greater when they read from a book. They can touch it. And some people refer that the specialists say that it's a matter of immersion. It's a cognitive thing that it helps you understand better, participate better. So, yes, 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 yes. Thank you.
I would like to talk about the audiobooks that I find very useful because I love touching the book and getting immersed. It's a culture, it's a pastime, my favorite pastime. But oftentimes after work, etc., I just have no energy to read. I can read 5-10 minutes and I start, read. So I found that audiobooks are very useful for me because In the US, the traffic time that I take, I just listen to audiobook in the car. I listen to audiobooks when I walk. So I'm using the interdisciplinarity for digital literature and physical education as well. So it's
Yes.
very, it keeps me walking when I'm exercising and I'm freeing my mind.
Yes, yes.
I can talk.
Yes. What one finds out is that we can use both book, audiobook, and the computer for different reasons in different moments of the day. So both three, all three are useful. We are using them for different purposes.
I think one of the most striking examples of writing online, digitized is the Plague Archives of the University of Rochester. So we wrote all these illuminated manuscripts in single editions, colored given to friends. So he was a printer, but he resented reproduction. So every bit, several copies of Jerusalem or the Book of Lost or all these illuminated manuscripts were made individually, kind of particularly. But what the archive has done, which again I think relates to what we've been talking about, is what putting Blake online has meant that a scholar, and it's pretty extraordinary, every single book of William Blake's illuminated books in all the different colors are displayed in a very elegant, easy to use way in the Blake archives. So if you're studying his Jerusalem, you have access visually, simultaneously to every single copy of Jerusalem, each page colored differently and have it simultaneously displayed. Very un-Blake. His whole aesthetic during his lifetime. But it's a remarkable example, and like the Whitman archive. If anybody's interested, just go in the Blake archives. It's spectacular.
We have many archives, digital archives now. We have Blake's and Kafka's and Proust's and Goethe. And it's becoming all digital and it's very useful. It's very.
Also have the audio portion. So you have the Italian, you have an English translation by John Hollander, I think, and then you could, poke in the Italian, you read along with someone reading the Italian.
And sometimes we have a website that it's a library, an edition, as I was saying, an archive, even a museum. Emily Dickinson's archive is a kind of museum also. You can go and see the house where she was living. So, yes.
What better way to teach literature and to inspire young people to read literature as well? Thank you very much.
Thank you.